As Angie said, my work has been focused really around the intersection of meditation, mindfulness, and trauma. And it's been a place of focus for the last 15 years. And I've been lucky enough to be connected to a number of people, different universities, Brown University, Harvard, and really trying to answer the question, what would we need to know as practitioners or as people who are offering mindfulness instruction? What would we need to know about trauma to be able to be in service, both, again, to ourselves in our own practice and to others? And this is it's a very intense time to be talking about the relationship between mindfulness and trauma, at least in my experience. Really, it's been, for the last, year and a half now with the global pandemic, any time that I am lucky enough to get to present on mindfulness and trauma, people's experience of trauma is often very present. That, we can be having almost like a intellectual conversation about trauma, but also the adversity, the stress, the difficulty that we are facing in our lives, or that our families and communities are facing, or the people that we work with, that will be present, that will be here. And so I'm saying that to remind us all, as Angie just beautifully led us, to be gentle with ourselves. And if at any point during this session, as we're talking about trauma, if you need to take a break, need to stretch a little bit, get some water, please be self-responsive. Please take care of yourself here inside of the session. We'll be doing a mixture here of also some practice, and there'll be some lecture. So I'll be introducing you really to this framework around trauma-informed practice, but I also want this to be dynamic for all of you. So there's the chance for us to practice together. And, ultimately, I want you to be coming away from this session with some very grounded tools that you can use. I'm hoping some of them will be new for many of you, and also a framework that you can apply in your work. So how the session will go is I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma-informed meditation and mindfulness. I'm just going to set a little bit of scaffolding for us, or a foundation to build on. And then we'll move more into practices over the session. So we'll talk about different frameworks that you can work with and actual different practices that you can use around your breath and your body. There'll also be chances for question and answer. I love to engage with the community. It's partly why I love coming here, and I was really excited to connect with all of you. So if you have questions, please chat them along the way, and Angie and I will do our best at certain times to respond to your questions here. I won't be watching the chat directly, so if you chat me directly, I won't necessarily see it. Just want to begin with a personal story. Let you know a little bit about why I care about this topic so much. So I grew up in Canada, and I was a meditator, and I'm a psychotherapist, and I was doing work around trauma. And my mindfulness practice was very helpful as a psychotherapist to support me when I was working with people. At some point, the trauma that I was working with, I began to have some symptoms, and I was very burnt out and having a difficult time. And I was on some meditation retreats, and I was having a very difficult time in practice, where I was finding myself really focusing on traumatic thoughts, memories of certain sessions that I had had. I was feeling very dysregulated and having difficulty. And the general instruction from the teachers that I worked with was just to continue focusing on the sensations or what was dysregulating. They basically said, just take it back to your cushion, to your meditation cushion. And sometimes that was helpful, but other times it was creating more difficulty. And that was 15 years ago, well, actually 18 years ago now. And I got very curious about what was happening for me. And in my study and my inquiry, it really came to this relationship between trauma and meditation. And what I learned inside of my work, and really what I want to communicate with all of you here, is that mindfulness and meditation can either be helpful or unhelpful for people and communities who are struggling with trauma, which in this particular moment around the global pandemic, the ongoing stress and trauma that so many people are facing, I think it's very important for all of us to have some awareness about the fact that it can be kind of a double-edged sword in our work. And the good news is that your awareness about this topic is, I'd say, at least 50% of the competence that you can gain. If you have some awareness about this, you will be way ahead of people who do not have awareness. So just that you're being here, that you're watching the recording or here live, my hope is this will be very helpful for you, either in your personal practice or where you're offering the practice. So let me spend a moment here just laying a bit of groundwork about what I mean by trauma. And then from there, we'll move into a practice together before we pause and we actually have some time for question and answer. So let me share my screen here. And Angie or others, just jump in. Let me know if this doesn't this doesn't work. Okay, there we go. So, just very briefly, of course, I know that Sarah talked about mindfulness extensively this morning and that you have a lot of different frameworks here. But I define mindfulness in quite traditional way around sustained present moment attention. This is our ability to know what's happening when it's happening. It's a quote from Joseph Goldstein. And it is an incredible competency to be able to have this quality of sometimes called dual awareness. So, even as you're listening to me right now, can you be aware of sensations in the body? Can you see or hear me while also feeling your buttocks in the chair, perhaps, or maybe your feet on the ground? Or you could also see if you could be present here with the content while also being aware of your emotional state. Like what's your mood right now? And as we'll be talking about more in this session, mindfulness can be very, very helpful for those of us that have experienced trauma. And one of the reasons here is that trauma will often bring us into the past, where mindfulness can bring us into the present. So again, you might have your own lived experience or examples around this, but maybe you are always having memories of a particular difficult circumstance, almost like your body is responding to the present moment as if the trauma was still happening. Mindfulness can help us arrive in the present moment and become aware of these memories while also being aware of our surrounding environment. So let's actually do a short practice together around this. I just invite you to orient with mindfulness to your current time and space. So becoming aware of the time of day or where you are right now. Again, while still staying connected to me here, can you also still orient to the here and now? Knowing what's happening in your surroundings, that we're here in this session together. This is the muscle that we grow around mindfulness, that has huge benefits when it comes to trauma and working with stress more generally. So let's talk a little bit about trauma as a way to just be clear about what we're talking about here. Of course, we could spend the whole session talking about definitions of trauma, but the easiest way I found to talk about trauma is around a spectrum, because trauma is a form of stress. And so we can think about trauma on a wide spectrum, and that we don't need to get always too specific about, well, is this post-traumatic stress disorder, or where are we? We can actually just widen out and know that there's a spectrum. So let me talk about this spectrum for a moment. So on the one end of the spectrum, we have stress. And many of you here in the community, I know, are doing active work around stress. You work with clients, you're in healthcare. So stress, here's a definition: the non-specific response of the body to any demand for change. And what I appreciate about this definition, it's a reminder that stress is neither good nor bad. Stress is anything that is requiring or asking some kind of change from us. So, I was getting on the computer here and trying to figure out my Wi-Fi, and any little thing, or, you could get someone says you just received a promotion. Many things can cause us stress. We tend to talk about stress negatively, but it's really anything that's asking for change. Now, on the next part of the spectrum, we have traumatic stress. And trauma is really the most intense form of stress, I'd say negative stress, that we can experience. And here's a definition: that traumatic stress is the response to shocking and emotionally overwhelming situations that may involve actual or threatened death, serious injury, or threat to physical integrity. So when we're talking about trauma, we're really talking about a threat to our life and our limb, that it often involves a feeling that our survival is on the line, that there's something very intense happening. And I mention that because trauma is sometimes talked about in increasingly broad ways. And I think there's something important about kind of keeping a container around the word trauma and what we mean by that. So we're talking about very intense, shocking, and emotionally overwhelming situations. Now, as many of you will know, but it's important to state, we can experience trauma in different ways. So we can experience trauma directly through experiencing it, say a car accident, for example. But there's other ways where the impact of trauma will ripple out from the actual event, and we can experience trauma in different ways. So, for example, we might witness a traumatic event, or we might learn that a trauma happened to a family member or close friend, or we might have repeated exposure to trauma. Remember my example earlier in my life, being around trauma a lot, that can also have a lot of impacts on us to be exposed all the time. I know many of you are here doing active work around trauma, and you know the costs of that. So traumatic stress, we can experience it in different ways. Now, next on the spectrum, I'll just say a couple more things, and then again, we'll shift towards a practice. We have something known as post-traumatic stress. And this is stress that we are experiencing beyond an actual traumatic event or series of events. So many of us, the majority of us, will experience trauma in our lifetime. So some of you on this here in the session, you might have had experienced trauma really quite recently or in this last year. And that does not mean that you will be worse for wear. We live through trauma, but we also heal from trauma. Of course, we are deeply resilient as people, as communities. So again, just because we live through trauma, it doesn't mean we have ongoing symptoms. However, there are some people who experience what's known as post-traumatic stress, symptoms that are carrying on past the traumatic event. There's a couple different areas that we could talk about here. Very briefly, intrusion. So some symptoms that we are having intrusive thoughts, intrusive memories, or maybe we have avoidance. We are actively avoiding sensations in the body, or we're avoiding memories of the trauma, or even particular locations that we might avoid. So that's also a behavior with post-traumatic stress. And also we have what's known as arousal and reactive symptoms. So that means that in our nervous system, we're often experiencing too much or too little energy, that at any point we could be very hypervigilant, or we might actually be very numb and dissociated. So those are some areas around post-traumatic stress. And again, some of you might be experiencing this yourselves. You might know people who are experiencing post-traumatic stress. It's a period of history, I'd say, where post-traumatic stress is very prevalent right now. And then finally, we have post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Again, there might be some of you here where, deep bow, you might be trauma professionals, so you know this. But for others that are new, PTSD is when we take these different areas of symptoms and we say, if you have these symptoms for this amount of time, often in this case for a month, then you qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD. Again, many of you would be familiar with PTSD. Okay, so why am I saying this? This is just to acknowledge that in any moment, here we have this very powerful community coming together in this webinar. In any moment, in any community, there will be a whole spectrum of trauma. So research says 90% of us will live through a traumatic event. And it seems like most of us, it would be 100% that will experience trauma in our lives in some level. And that 3.5% of the population in any given moment will be experiencing PTSD. So that means that there is a range of experiences that are happening. Now, my work here, as I talked about with Angie beforehand and work that we've done, it's not to train you all to be able to diagnose post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder. I train people around trauma-sensitive or trauma-informed practice. We'll talk more about that. It's not to become a trauma professional, but it's to be able to acknowledge there is this wide range of trauma and that we can learn how to be prepared to work with it skillfully. It's not that you're training to ask questions and say, well, is this experience post-traumatic stress disorder, or what's happening? It's actually to say, it sounds like this person might have experienced trauma. What are the interventions that I could bring or offer, either to myself or to others, that would help them gain the full benefits of meditation practice? Because just because someone's experienced trauma, it doesn't mean they shouldn't meditate. On the contrary, we want people to be practicing, meditating, but they may need specific tools to be able to access the benefits of practice. So that's what I wanted to cover around trauma. Let me say one thing briefly about trauma-sensitive mindfulness, because that's the topic title of this presentation. And then we'll do a practice, and then we'll open it up for some question and answer. Here's a proposed definition of trauma-sensitive mindfulness. At the most basic level, trauma-sensitive means that we are sensitive to the needs of people who are struggling with trauma. That's really what we're dealing with here. I believe, it's a very important moment to be trauma-sensitive or trauma-informed, as it's sometimes talked about. But here's a definition. It involves 4 R's. Very briefly, if you are trauma-sensitive in meditation, you have done work first to realize how widespread the impact of trauma is. You can recognize trauma symptoms. You can respond to them effectively. And the whole time, you're working to actively avoid re-traumatization. I think of these 4 R's like 4 notes of a chord, played all at the same time. So you've realized how widespread trauma is. You can recognize trauma symptoms. You can respond effectively, and you're working to avoid re-traumatization in your work. That's really what we're up to. So let's do a practice together. We can talk about this all we want about what do we mean trauma sensitive, but I want to offer you a mindful practice here to help you feel what I mean by trauma sensitive. And then we'll pause and we'll have some time for questions and dialogue. So this will be about 4 or 5 minute practice. And to begin, I invite you to kind of pause, take a sacred pause here, maybe taking a couple of deeper breaths as we begin. You could have your eyes open, or you can have your eyes closed. And just begin here by checking in with your experience in this moment, noticing what's present for you, whether physically, coming back to some of the practices that Angie was helping us with, the session, feeling our hands, maybe our feet, maybe feeling your emotional state or your mood or thoughts that are present, just acknowledging them, just recognizing what's here and allowing it to be here as much as possible, not trying to change it. Then if you have your eyes closed, I invite you to open them, or you can just listen to my voice. This practice is going to involve working with our hands. You can also work with your feet, or you can just visualize this practice. This is also an optional practice, so at any point you want to shift, you're welcome to. I'm going to have my hands here, but you don't need to have them in the camera. You can have them down in your lap, just having them here so you can see them. So for the first part of this practice, the invitation is to make a fist with one hand. And as you're closing this fist, the invitation is to imagine that the job of this fist is to stay closed. And in staying closed, this fist is taking care of your safety. Yeah. So it has this job of taking care of your survival and your safety, and it's doing that by staying closed. Then, with the other hand, I'd like you to go ahead and try to pry open that fist and really be in the experiment of the fist, trying to open it, just seeing what happens here. What happens to the fist? What happens to your breath? Are you successful or not? What happens? Yeah. Okay, then you can let that go. It's part one of the practice. Just noticing the impact here. And then for the second part of the practice, you're going to do the same thing. So fist is closed, taking care of your safety. And then the invitation is to bring a quality of care, compassion, curiosity, and respect into this other hand. Just bringing presence and really mindfulness. And then in your own time, go ahead and place the hand underneath that fist. And as you do that, it's like you're communicating something like, good job. I respect that you're closed. And actually, there's something very intelligent about you closing. You're taking care of safety. And I am here and I'm just being present with you. I have no agenda for you to open. Just here with you. And then just notice what's happening here. Is it the same, different than the first round? You could also notice, are there any particular words or phrases that the closed fist would want to hear, that would feel supportive? Like, I understand why you're closed. Or I'm here. I'm just simply here with you. Just experimenting with that for a moment. And then in the next few breaths, we'll be shifting from this practice, knowing that you can return here at any point. Just beginning to let that go. And then we'll pause once more at the end of this practice before we shift. Just taking a moment, noticing what that was like for you, just what the experience was, any learning, noting if it was different between the first and the second. And just an experiment. The reason that I wanted to do this practice, based on everything that we talked about so far, is that, as I said earlier, when we're working with trauma, we're really at the domain of life and limb. It's really about survival. And so when we're working with ourselves or other people, they will have strategies that have taken care of their safety and their survival. And when it comes to trauma, if we try to, force people to open or change, or we have agendas for them, it tends to, as many of you know, it tends to not go well. We need to come with a certain quality, as Angie was just saying, of safety in ourselves and extending safety to others. It's really a quality of presence that we can cultivate. So I offer that as a practice that we can do for ourselves and for others. I was in a meditation group on Zoom, and there was someone in the group who, after a meditation, they said, I just really didn't like that meditation. I felt frustrated, angry, and they just said, I wanted to run away. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to be in this group. And the teacher, I was very curious, like, how will the teacher work with this? And the teacher said, do you know how far away you want to go? You want to run away. How far away do you want to go? And the student was very surprised. And they said, wow. I said, well, I'd like to run up this hill outside my house. And the teacher said, well, would you like to do that? Would you like to go ahead and do that? And then just come back here and let us know how it went. The student was very surprised and went outside and ended up running up and down this hill for a moment. And they came back to the group, and there was a look of joy. There was a look of like, they were very red in the face, happy. And they said, thank you so much for trusting me, for trusting that I know what I needed. And I thought, wow, that was a real example of a teacher bringing this quality of safety, of presence to this person's experience. Now, whether they had trauma or not, that might be another conversation. But that's the idea here, is that we're approaching life with this quality of respect and with care. So again, appreciate all of you sharing here. Okay, so let me shift into talking about a framework of how you can recognize trauma, remember those R's, and how you can respond effectively. That first R, but realizing just by you being here on this webinar session, I think that's a big part of that first R. And then those two R's of recognizing and responding. That's what we're going to focus on here. And then we'll move into some actual practices that you can do. So the model that's proven most useful in my work, as some of you will know, I know Angie knows this, is the window of tolerance, which comes from the neuroscientist Dan Siegel out of UCLA. And this window has been applied in many different domains. Healthcare, it's talked about in terms of actually the environment, different systems. But we're going to talk about the window here in terms of the nervous system. And this is going to help you recognize when you or someone that you're around may be experiencing traumatic stress and what you can do about it inside of your work. So the basic idea of the window is that it's a zone between what you could call too much and too little. And again, we could apply this in any system, like a family system or a healthcare system. But we'll talk about the nervous system, that there's this kind of middle ground where we can be alert, but we're still relaxed. Our heart is beating, but it's not racing. Or, we might feel stress, but we don't feel completely taken out and overwhelmed by it. Yeah, so there's lots of ways we could talk about the window, but it's basically a window where we can literally tolerate our experience. Now, briefly, on either side of this window, we have sort of too much and too little. So the technical term is hyperarousal. And this is when we're feeling hypervigilant, very full of rage, or very stressed out, a lot of energy in the body. It's more hyperarousal. And then on the bottom, we have hypoarousal, meaning too little physiological arousal. So this is where we might feel spacey or numb or dissociated or foggy. And I want to give you a moment here just to notice, where are you right now in your window of tolerance? Are you more in the yellow in your window? Or are you more towards hyper arousal or hypoarousal? You could even imagine, where would you place yourself on this slide? Would you place yourself somewhere in the middle, or up top, or on the bottom? And then see if you can notice what told you that that's where you are in your window right now. Because that's very much a mindfulness practice, is being able to observe the information that tells us what's happening for us. So for example, for me, I feel pretty solidly in my window, maybe up a little bit in the top of the yellow window, but I can feel my buttocks in the chair. I feel my chest, my breath feels steady. I feel aware that I'm here with all of you. So that's where I'd place myself. What would be for you? Maybe it's certain thoughts, certain sensations. And then I want to say two things about the window as it relates to trauma. The first thing is that no matter where you are in your window right now, that's fine. We don't want to make hyper or hypoarousal bad or something negative. Again, coming back to the fist, they're deeply intelligent responses. We all have them. And this is a way of trying to respond to the world around us. So first of all, wherever you are, that's totally fine. But second, trauma will tend to push us outside of our window of tolerance. If we're experiencing trauma or we're experiencing post-traumatic stress, we tend to experience something known as dysregulated arousal, which means that we're in hyper or hypoarousal. So, a couple of examples for this is, I work with a client who said, at any moment, I feel like I'm just going to be filled with rage and hypervigilant, and I'll be sweating, and I feel so panicked, and I don't feel like I'm in control of when I'm in hyperarousal. Or some people might say, I was watching a movie, or I was with my friend, and all of a sudden I became very dissociated and numb. I was in hypoarousal. So this is a very common symptom of post-traumatic stress. You might remember here, I talked about arousal and reactive symptoms. This is a core symptom of post-traumatic stress, is this oscillation between hyper and hypoarousal, or finding ourselves out of the window all the time. Okay, so why is this useful for us here in trauma-sensitive mindfulness? We can learn signs of dysregulated arousal. We can train ourselves to become attuned to nonverbal signs that we or someone that we're working with might be experiencing dysregulated arousal. Now, just because someone's experiencing dysregulated arousal, it does not mean that they've necessarily experienced trauma. However, it can be a very helpful, kind of like a flag for us. Like, oh, wow, okay, well, this person is having, they're sweating in practice. They have an exaggerated startle response. They're very vigilant. maybe I should have a conversation with them about what's happening in practice, or maybe I'm feeling dissociated in practice. Let me work with that. So signs of dysregulated arousal, we can learn them. So this is a slide, and Angie, I forgot to ask you this, but I'm hoping we could send this to everyone, or I could just send it to you. We can figure it away, but I want you to have a chance, or you could take a screenshot if you like. But these will be two different signs here of hyper and hypoarousal. So again, it's a very exhaustive list, but this will give you a sense of what you can start to track for. Agitation, some hyperactivity, tingling, twitching, feeling like you're hyperventilating, that shortness of breath, increased heart rate. There's so many different things that we can look for. The easiest way to talk about this is like the accelerator of the car is slammed to the ground. Yeah. And we're experiencing too much arousal. We also have signs of, it should say not dissociation, signs of hypoarousal. So these are different signs that we're more down in the blue. Yeah. And this is where we're experiencing, we might be more frozen and still, or pale skin tone, or, when you're with someone and they're kind of looking out onto the horizon, they're there, but they're not really there. They're more dissociated. So there's lots of different things that we can learn to track for in terms of dissociation. So those are some different signs around the window. And let me just come back here. Again, we'll find ways to make sure you have those if you want them. But that is a basic idea around being able to recognize trauma. Again, that second R. We can start to track for signs that someone is outside of their window of tolerance. Now, for the rest of the session here, we're going to be working with practices that support your window of tolerance. And here's my proposal to you all, and then I'll pause and see if there's any questions. My proposal is that sometimes it will be useful in your meditation practice to do something different than meditation. One of the ways this is talked about is the difference between being with and working with our experience. Sometimes it will be the most important thing will be just simply being with our experience in a non-judgmental way. Yeah, so I'm sitting in meditation, I'm experiencing pain or discomfort, and I'm able to just be with my experience. I'm cultivating mindfulness. There are other times where I actually want to work with my experience. I'm going to do something actively different. So maybe I place my hand on my heart. Maybe I go for a walk, or I talk to a friend. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not still being mindful. Of course, we're doing both all the time. These are often talked about like two wings of a bird. We need both. But my proposal here is that being with is not always enough when it comes to trauma. That there might be times in your meditation practice where if you are outside of your window, you may need some specific interventions to come back into your window, and that will actually support your practice. Now, what I'm not saying, and then I'll pause, I am not saying that if you are uncomfortable or you're even experiencing pain in meditation, that you should immediately do something different. Like, I'm experiencing pain, maybe it's connected to trauma, I'm just going to go for a walk, or I'm going to watch TV. On the contrary, I encourage people to stay with their experience, but just know that they have some tools that they can work with that enable them to come back in their window. So let's move into some practices together. These are going to be, standard mindfulness practices that involve still cultivating that muscle of awareness, but some of these might be new or different, and you can see if they're useful for you. It's, again, having some tools in your toolkit if you are finding yourself very dysregulated and out of your window in practice. So the first practice I'd like to do here with you all, it may be something that's familiar, but that's working with multiple anchors of attention. So this is becoming more mainstream. People are working with this. I know Angie's brought it into her work and working on the Brahm Center. The breath is often the main focus for us or other people when it comes to meditation practice, when we're cultivating mindfulness. And it's very useful. We need to have something of an anchor where we can focus our attention and cultivate some mental stability. Yeah. The issue here is that the breath will not always be neutral for people that are struggling with trauma. So the respiratory system is connected to our sympathetic nervous system, and this can be connected to traumatic experience. So when you're asking someone to just pay attention to the breath, that might involve bringing them right back in to a traumatic activation or connecting them with a traumatic experience. So because of that, it's useful to have multiple anchors of attention that we can work with. Sometimes for some people, it won't be the breath. It will be working with other sensations. So we're going to do a practice here of working with 3 different anchors of attention that you can incorporate into your practice or in your instruction that you can offer to others. This is going to involve working with the breath, second, sensations, and then third, we'll also work with sound. And so we'll start with sensations, we'll go to sound, and then we'll go to breath. And this is just an experiment. If at any point you feel like you want to shift, do something different, of course you're welcome to if you're feeling overwhelmed. Otherwise, I invite you to find the posture here that feels supportive of a short practice. A posture where you can be both alert but also ideally relaxed. You're welcome to have your eyes open and downcast or closed, whatever feels supportive and comfortable for you. And just begin here by seeing if you can recognize what's here, what's present. Just noticing this beautiful practice over and over again of simply recognizing and allowing what's here to be here. And then when you're ready, I invite you to choose some sensations that are not connected to the breath to focus and anchor your attention. So common examples would be the feet, sensations of the feet touching the ground, or maybe the hands that are pressed together in your lap, or perhaps the buttocks in the chair, or even your shoulders, but just seeing if you can focus on a sensation or set of sensations that isn't overtly tied, connected to the breath. And then once you're there, just see if you can rest and settle your attention on this anchor. Letting it be a point of attention and focus for this next minute. And if at any point during the practice you find yourself distracted or lost in thought, the instruction is to gently bring your attention back to this anchor. For some, it's talked about as a kind of refuge. To let your attention anchor and to cultivate some stability of mind. Of course, we become lost and then we just gently come back. And then in the next few breaths, we'll shift to a second anchor, and that's sound. So whenever you're ready, bringing your attention to the experience of hearing, if that's available to you. Seeing if you can simply be with the experience of hearing and letting that be an anchor. Not necessarily traveling out to sounds, but letting yourself be receptive. Letting hearing be a point of focus and attention. Taking in your soundscape. Also noticing the quality of connection with this anchor. Is it easier or more difficult to stay connected to it compared to the first one? Keeping some awareness about this practice, some learning. And then in the next few breaths, I invite you to shift to a third anchor here, which will be working with the breath, very traditional anchor. This could be the sensations at the nostrils, or the rising and falling of the abdomen or the chest. The breath is very dynamic, often in motion. So seeing if you can tie in to some aspect of the breath as a way to cultivate mindfulness, some mental stability here. This is a place you can return to whenever you find yourself distracted. Just like a puppy who wanders away, bringing it gently back. And then for the final part of this practice, simply noticing what would be your preferred anchor to work with right now. If we were going to do a 20-minute meditation, which would you choose? Or maybe it's a different anchor entirely. And just noting that for yourself. It's useful to know why we choose the anchors that we do. Great. And then in the next few breaths, we'll be shifting here. So invite you to begin letting this practice go. It could be with a couple of deeper breaths or a little bit of movement, but just preparing to come back here. Okay, great. So that is first trauma-sensitive practice around working with different anchors of attention. And choice is a very big part of trauma-sensitive practice. Choice is often taken away from people who've experienced trauma or are experiencing post-traumatic stress. And the more that we can experience a sense of choice and agency in our practice, the better it is. So giving people these choices, I think, can be very useful. I think I saw a hand raise. And I want to say if it's a specific question about this practice, be great to address it. And then otherwise we'll move on to a couple more practices. I'm not sure if it's this person's still here. Okay, you can please save that question. I just saw it come across the screen. So for the second practice here, we're going to do a very practical regulation practice that involves working with the hands and the breath. This is a practice that comes from someone named Timothy Goddard, who is a Qigong practitioner and trauma professional who's also a mindfulness teacher, NBSR and MBCT. So they have many hats that they wear. They live in Melbourne, Australia. And I was there teaching, doing some work around trauma-sensitive meditation. And Timothy had been teaching for about 20 years. And I said, what is your number one practice around helping people to regulate when they're out of their window? If they're finding that meditation is not useful, if it's too much for them, they're overwhelmed, what do you do? What practice do you do? And she said, this is my favorite. By far and away, this is my favorite. So we'll do this together. I'm going to have my hands here, but you do not need to have them up here. You can have them down in your lap if you want. And I'm going to have my hands like this, but you can also have your hands like this. There's a movement. Or you can work with your feet, same movement, or you can visualize this practice. So to begin, just invite you to take a moment here and once again, just drop your attention internal. Notice the quality of your breathing right now. And then here's what we're going to do. I'm going to have you have your hands about shoulder width apart, maybe a little closer in. Again, you don't have to have them up here. You can have them down. And invite you to expand and contract your hands with the inhalation and the exhalation of the breath. So it would be something like inhaling, exhaling. Yeah. Inhaling, exhaling. Could also look like this. Inhaling, exhaling. And as you do that, finding the rhythm that works best for you. We're all different. So what is the pace and the depth that feels most regulating and supportive for you? We can just stay curious and also feel the way here that you're in control of your breath, that you are dictating how deep the breath will be and the pace of it. This is important when it comes to working with trauma. We often feel out of control, and this is a way to feel more in control. And finally, just notice where you'd like to focus your attention. Sometimes it's the sensations of the hands, or maybe it's the hands and the breath. Just notice where it's most regulating and supportive to actually be focusing your attention. Good. We'll do just a couple more breaths here. Great. And then in the next few breaths, you can let that go. Okay. Good. So those are kind of just some practical ones. If you find yourself out of your window, you want to keep meditating, maybe you need some extra support, that can be a useful one. So we've done different anchors. We've done this breath and hands practice. We're going to do another one here that involves working with physical contact, making contact with oneself. There's some research that suggests that just the simple act of making physical contact with the body with some degree of presence can be highly regulating, that it can, figuratively support the window of tolerance. But there's different ways that we can do this. Similar to the anchors, we want to be providing people with different choices. We want to have some different examples at our disposal. So I'd like to guide you through practice here. And then I'll offer a couple more kind of practical details, and then we'll shift over to some question and answer. So same as before, finding a posture that you'd like to be in. And we'll do 3 different rounds of making physical contact. And each of these are optional, of course. Just invite you to be in the experiment here of noticing which ones feel best. And we'll start here with the kind of the most traditional form of making contact with self, and that's a hand on the heart. There's a couple variations here. You could have both hands on the heart, or a hand on the heart and the belly. You could mix your hands around, just noticing, finding for yourself what you'd like to practice with. And then notice the placement and the pressure of the hand or the hands. You could see if you want more pressure or less. Maybe you want the hand in a different place. Whatever's going to feel most supportive for you here. And then just taking a mindful moment with this physical contact. You're bringing a quality of presence to the body. It's almost like that practice earlier with the hand and the fist. You're just bringing a quality of care and true non-judgmental presence. You could feel and focus your attention on what it's like to offer that contact, or maybe on the sensations at the chest or belly of receiving the contact. Or you could feel both. Mostly feeling the presence and extension of care. And just noticing what happens. No expectations, but whether this causes relaxation or really just seeing what's happening for you. Okay, good. And then the second practice here is to have a hand at the base of the neck. So I'll show you here. So really at the occiput, the base of the skull here, having your hand at the top part of the neck, base of the skull. It's a proposed place to have the hand. And just bringing a quality of presence once again. And if it's helpful, and again, finding the pressure that feels most regulating. This is not a practice to check out. It's actually a practice to stay very mindful, noticing the placement, the pressure. Some people like having a hand on their forehead as a way to provide some containment. Whatever feels best for you here. And we'll just be here for a couple breaths. You could experiment with what hand. Or if this feels uncomfortable, you can always visualize it or do something different. It's very common here in work around trauma that we make contact with the oldest parts of the brainstem through literal physical contact, providing some reassurance on some level. We're here. Okay, and then you can begin to let that go. And then the last practice is for containment. It's a form of self-contact that involves having us feel a degree of a container. So often with trauma, there can be this feeling like we're going outside of the boundaries of our body, or we're not really in control. And this can be a very helpful physical sensation for people. And so there's a couple different options here. So one would be to have both hands underneath the armpits, or you could have one hand on the armpit and one hand on the bicep. Or you could have both hands on the biceps. Really, it's your choice here, whatever feels good. And then once again, just noticing the placement and the pressure. For some people, they love this. It feels very supportive, like a weighted blanket. For others, maybe it's not as effective, but just seeing if you can notice and be in the experiment for yourself here, but the form of physical contact that feels most regulating, most supportive of your window. Good. And then in the next few breaths, you can let this one go. And then we'll just take a brief pause here before shifting back. Just noticing if you had a preference of which one or how that practice was for you. And then we'll return here. Okay. I'll offer one more practical practice, and then we'll see if there's any questions. And depending on where we go, we could do some more practices, but I want to make sure there's time for you all around practice. So I want to just briefly mention referrals. If you are someone who, well, often the question comes up, when would I know when to meditate or when to do something different? When would I, if I'm someone who's a meditation teacher or a coach or an educator, when would I just keep offering meditation instruction? And when would I actually suggest that a person gets more support, whether it be a mental health professional or a trauma professional? You know, there might be times where we're working with someone where we feel like, wow, I do not have the competency to be able to work with this person around the trauma that they're working with. My proposal to you all would be, if you're working with someone, or if in your own practice, you find that during meditation, you are becoming more dysregulated, meaning that you're out of your window and you're further out of your window inside of practice, or maybe even later that day, that's a cue that someone likely needs more support than you or that meditation can provide. So just to repeat that, if a student that I'm working with is out of their window and during meditation, things get worse, or they send me an email 2 days later and they say, I feel very, very dysregulated, then I might say, we need to talk about you getting some support around trauma work, or I might just say, just some general support. The final recommendation about that is, if you are to recommend that someone receives some support around their stress or their trauma, to do so in a way that is uplifting and supportive versus shaming and isolating. So, you know, I hear a lot of stories about people say, my teacher just said, like, I can't work with you and you're too much. You have to go see a therapist. And they felt really ashamed. Versus if a meditation teacher said, hey, I really care about you, and my commitment here is to support you in your practice. And based on what you're telling me, I'm in a question about whether it would be supportive for you to have some individual support working with some of the things that you've talked to me about. So it's almost like we're with them side by side, and we're helping them see that we're trying to support them, as opposed to saying, I can't work with you and you should just go see someone else. So I recommend trying to be as supportive as possible whenever we are referring on to someone else.